Welcome to News4Scotland with Scotland's real news, news that you'll never hear on Anglo-UK mainstream TV. Here are this week's headlines. Rachel Reeves has announced an additional $820 million for Scotland in her budget on Wednesday, in a bid to reverse Labour's disastrous polling here. However, $820 million is peanuts against the backdrop of the billions siphoned off by the UK government from Scotland's revenues and resources each year. The Fraser of Allender Institute described the allocation as relatively small, adding there is no detail yet as to how this money would break down year by year. It's the result of increased spending in England, but Reeves, desperate to shore up so-called Scottish Labour's leader Anna Sarwar's standing north of the border, said she made the funding available because he had asked her to. The benefits of investment and growth must be built and felt in every part of our United Kingdom, Reeves told the Commons. Beleaguered Sarwar jumped on the opportunity handed to him by Reeves's announcement, claiming, "I demanded a Labour budget rooted in Labour values, and that is what the Chancellor has delivered today," even though he had previously been unable to say if he had lobbied the Chancellor in a TV interview days before. This budget means child poverty down, energy bills down, wages up, and austerity rejected, he claimed. Child poverty is already lower in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK, and has already been falling under the SNP Holyrood administration for years now. Energy bills, however, are among the highest in the world, even though Scotland is self-sufficient in clean renewable energy, because the UK controls energy policy and is insisting on building massively expensive toxic nuclear plants, which Scots bill payers are also having to subsidise. Meanwhile, tax as a share of GDP is expected to rise to a historic high, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the spending watchdog responsible for the unprecedented leak of Reeves's speech before Wednesday's budget announcement. The amount individuals can save in an ISA without being taxed is being reduced from $20,000 to $12,000. Reeves confirmed that the UK government would freeze income tax thresholds, bringing ordinary workers into higher rates as earnings rise. This will not affect taxpayers in Scotland. However, it may force the Scottish government to take similar measures, given that higher taxes at a UK level will cut funding for Holyrood. National insurance rates will also be frozen, and this will affect workers in Scotland. Trade Union Unite said that they estimated this would mean an extra 10 million workers paying the higher rate of tax by 2030. The union's General Secretary Sharon Graham said, "The Chancellor has picked a side. Health workers, engineers and tanker drivers will pay by stealth taxes, while city bankers and billionaires are left unscathed." Mike Ambery, Director of Retirement Savings at Standard Life, said the move will inevitably increase costs and reduce take-home pay for many. Reeves also announced that the two-child universal credit cap will be abolished in England from April, although the Scottish Government has already committed to this north of the border. Independence blogger Leah Gunn Barrett said, "Reeves's make-or-break budget amounts to little more than rearranging deck chairs on the UK Titanic. She won't dare tarnish her neoliberal credentials, burnished by her allegiance to the UK economy's crown jewel, the City of London laundromat, by introducing measures to help ordinary people, such as taxing wealth and investing in the productive economy." English Defence Secretary John Healey has confirmed that 3 sites in Scotland are being considered for new munitions factories, as London ramps up the prospect of war with Russia. If the sites, which include Grangemouth, Ardeer in North Ayrshire, and an undisclosed location in Dumfries and Galloway are built, these areas could become a target for Russia in a conflict Scotland had no say in. Healey said construction is due to start next year. The new factories would produce explosives and propellants used in weapons such as guns and artillery, and are viewed by some as necessary to make England less dependent on US firepower. Healey said the sites were needed to raise the war-fighting readiness of the army, with the Ministry of Defence adding, in a press release, that they would enable the UK's continued support to Ukraine, which is under pressure from US President Donald Trump, to back a peace deal with a deadline originally set for this week. The deal includes guaranteeing that Ukraine would not be admitted to NATO, although the West, led by the US, broke an agreement with Russia after the Berlin Wall came down, that NATO would not be expanded into former Soviet bloc countries. However, NATO has been expanded to Russia's borders. Healey meanwhile said that the government wanted to make the production of weapons and bombs the engine for economic growth, and that the factories would help bring back jobs to industrial areas. Arms companies have been invited to put forward proposals to produce the munitions. English UK Energy Secretary Ed Miliband has instructed GB Energy to start scouting Scottish sites for new nuclear power stations, despite the Scottish Government's opposition to nuclear power. Torness and Hunterston are believed to be two favoured locations for new nuclear power plants, which will leave radioactive nuclear waste in Scotland, even though the plants will be used to power homes and businesses in England. Scotland already has the capacity to produce more electricity than it needs, yet Westminster wants to turn our countryside into a nuclear export zone for England, says Scottish independence campaign group Believe in Scotland. The Scottish Government has used planning laws to prevent toxic nuclear plants in Scotland, but London is seeking to override Scotland's devolved administration to order up sites north of the border, for a policy Scotland doesn't want, need, nor benefit from. Scotland already generates more clean, cheap, renewable electricity than it consumes, but Scots pay the highest energy bills in the world as part of the UK, which also wants to build monster-sized eyesore pylons across Scotland to remove this electricity Scotland produces, to power homes in England. The equivalent of 113% of our gross electricity demand was produced by renewables in 2022, and production is going up. In 2023, a third of the electricity Scotland produced was exported, mostly to England, with a net export of 15.9 terawatt-hours, worth roughly £1.5 billion. So if Scotland is already a net exporter of clean power, who exactly is this new nuclear capacity for? Certainly not for Scottish homes or businesses, said Believe in Scotland. Scotland is expected to host the reactors, take the environmental risk, and watch even more pylons march across our landscape to feed the southern grid of a neighbouring country. Exporting energy is a huge opportunity for an independent Scotland, said Believe in Scotland. But Scotland is keeping England's lights on, and in return we are paying 3, maybe 4 times what we should for energy. As part of the UK, Scottish businesses pay the world's highest commercial energy costs, whilst 31% of Scottish families are left in fuel poverty, said the group. All of that represents the cost of remaining in this dysfunctional union, where the distant Westminster government only views Scotland as an asset to be milked. The Scottish government has no control over Scottish energy. Energy in the UK is a reserved power, meaning decisions on generation, pricing and investment sit with the English government at Westminster. Holyrood cannot design a pricing system that reflects Scotland's renewable potential. It cannot require new projects to reinvest profits locally. It can only give planning permission for hydro. It can't ensure any project gets built. And it cannot stop GB Energy's budget from being quietly diverted into nuclear projects Scotland doesn't want nor need, said Believe in Scotland. The idea that the UK's nuclear policies benefit Scots is absurd. UK governments that Scotland didn't vote for privatised the energy system with electricity generated in Scotland, sold by private energy firms like SSE, to the UK energy systems operator. Taxes on their profits are paid to the UK Treasury in England, not Holyrood. The Scottish Government has no fiscal lever to capture the value of what's produced here. The output counts towards Scotland's GDP, but the revenues and tax receipts stay in London and are controlled by London. It's a statistical illusion that flatters the UK accounts and deflates Scotland's potential, said the group. We saw it with oil and gas, we're seeing it with renewables, and now nuclear is next in line. The UK works like a siphon. Value generated in Scotland flows south, while the costs and environmental impacts remain behind. The patient-led campaign group Just Treatment said that the UK is at risk of importing America's disastrous drug pricing crisis, as the UK government prepares to let the NHS pay 25% more for medicines, to end a trade fight with American pharma. Because Scotland is part of the UK, the move will impact Scotland's overall budgets too, leaving less for our NHS north of the border. Just Treatment called on the government in England to take steps to establish a system for developing and manufacturing medicines that puts patients first. Trump's backers have been circling our NHS for years. His ally Peter Thiel's company, Palantir, the US spy tech firm, which was handed a £330 million NHS contract in 2023, has been slammed by doctors for risking patient data. And now Trump is holding our NHS hostage, threatening tariffs unless we hand over even more cash to his billionaire pharma friends, according to an online petition. Once you give in to a bully, they don't stop there, so who knows what Trump will demand next? But here's the truth. This is only the beginning. Trump and his backers won't stop until American corporations are running our NHS for profit, turning our hospitals, our care, our medicines into cash cows. 26 million Americans cannot afford health insurance, and medical treatment is the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the US. We've already seen what happens when the NHS is treated like a business. Under the last government, Conservative peer Michelle Mone's company got a massive PPE deal that wasted millions and left staff exposed. Then England's NHS COVID app burned through millions more before being scrapped. When profits come first, patients and taxpayers pay the price. See our documentary, Condition Critical, Saving Scotland's NHS, exclusively on the Scotland Channel. Scotland's claim of right has been offered less than lip service for centuries, but in the face of an increasingly tyrannical, overreaching Westminster government, it is time for Scots to take it back. That's the view of Sarah Salyers of Salvo, which, with Liberation Scotland, is putting forward a bid to have Scotland decolonised at the United Nations. The claim of right defends our right to the laws and provisions which protect the common good and define us as Scots. Distinct, egalitarian and community-based, said Salyers. A peculiar feature of the UK Constitution is that it reflects the constitutional tradition of just one of the so-called partners in the 1707 Union between Scotland and England. From the Magna Carta of 1215 to the Bill of Rights, 1689, the British Constitution, the UK Constitution, is England's. From 1707 to the present, its development has been the development of English constitutional tradition. In fact, the United Kingdom includes nothing from Scotland's distinct, and 200 years older, constitution, despite core Scottish, pre-Union, constitutional acts appearing on the UK statute books where they sit, powerless and ignored, much like the Scottish MPs in Westminster, she said. The problem for any true UK constitution, of course, one where those Scottish acts sit alongside England's, is that the core constitutional principles of the two nations are irreconcilable. As Lord Cooper famously observed, the principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctively English principle, and has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. A parliament with unlimited authority not only has no Scottish equivalent, it stands in direct opposition to the Scottish constitutional principle of popular sovereignty, she added. The people of Scotland were guaranteed, as a condition of union, that the claim of right would be preserved. We have a legitimate expectation that neither Westminster nor any public authority will legislate to the contrary. One of the most encouraging aspects of the visit to the UN in Geneva has been the warmth of the reception our delegation received from the representatives of other countries, some also seeking decolonisation. Ayam Okel, from a human rights group in Egypt, commented, "My country was also colonised by the British, as were many African countries, and our natural resources were stolen. That is why we understand what has been happening in Scotland." Land reform in Scotland will go nowhere without a land tax, according to Respect Scottish Sovereignty's Leah Gunn Barrett. Scotland suffers from the highest concentration of private land ownership in the Western world, she said. 83% of rural Scotland is in private hands. Community land ownership accounts for 2.8%, environmental heritage ownership 2.5%, and publicly owned land 11.7%. Over the past 12 years, private rural land ownership has grown more concentrated. 433 landowners own 50% of the privately owned rural land. The Danish billionaire Lego heiress, Sophie Kirk Christiansen, recently purchased 3,525 hectares of land in Ross and Cromarty in the West Highlands for $25.2 million. The purchase was made through her company Strathconan Estates Limited. Sophia's father, Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, started buying up Highland land in 1995 when he purchased the 28,448-hectare Strathconan estate. He acquired the neighbouring estates of Scardroy for $5.55 million in 2013 and Legowan for $4.5 million in 2017. After Sophia took control of the company in 2023, she bought the Glenweg estate for $7.15 million in 2024. The Christiansen family's Scottish land holdings now total 43,630 hectares. These holdings are superseded by those of fellow Danish billionaire Anders Povelsen, Scotland's largest landowner. His properties span several Highland estates and total over 89,000 hectares. But, said Gunn Barrett, to make matters worse, foreign landowners like Christiansen and Povelsen don't pay tax on their land to the Scottish administration or to the UK Treasury, but to their home country of Denmark. The Danish government levies a land value tax at the national level, but it is paid to municipalities. And because Denmark taxes its citizens on the land they own, regardless of where it is located, Christiansen and Povelsen make substantial payments to Denmark and not Scotland, which is absurd. The UK, unlike Denmark, doesn't have a land tax. Instead, it taxes businesses that use land. That's why some of the richest landowners in Scotland, like the Duke of Buccleuch, pay no property tax on their land, although businesses on their land pay business rates. The recently passed Land Reform Scotland Bill falls far short of what is needed to actually reform land ownership. Former MSP and land reform campaigner Andy Whiteman has noted that the bill, like its predecessors in 2003 and 2016, will do nothing to address the concentration of land ownership, and may even worsen it, nor will it affect the current unequal distribution of land. That's because the bill doesn't tackle systemic problems, the biggest one being taxation. Land is the greatest fixed asset and store of wealth in Scotland that's not taxed. Although the devolved Scottish administration can't administer a national land tax, it can permit local authorities to manage their own land tax, as long as the revenue funds local services. A local land tax would have the added benefit of making local authorities more accountable to the people and injecting some badly needed local democracy. Commonweal has proposed replacing the regressive and outdated council tax and business rates, which tax only buildings and not the land, with a property tax that covers both. It would be controlled by local authorities and be based on a percentage of the market value of both buildings and land. The Scottish Secretary Douglas Alexander has done nothing to stick up for Scotland over a massive cut to Scotland's fishing funds, according to independence campaign group Believe in Scotland. This is despite the fact that Scotland accounts for almost 70% of total UK landings. As previously reported on News4Scotland, the government in England has slashed Scotland's share of fishing industry funding to less than 8% from a £360 million fund, which replaced an EU one, where Scotland received almost half the funding. England will receive more than 86% of the funds, even though Shetland alone lands more fish than the whole of England, Wales and Northern Ireland combined. English-UK Fisheries Minister Dame Angela Eagle refused to answer a question whether Scotland's Secretary of State, Douglas Alexander, had even spoken to her about the decision. Instead, she offered a deflection about post-Brexit quota uplifts, claiming Scotland had already got a reasonable deal. Scotland contributes disproportionately when it comes to resources, fresh water and the sea, energy exports, food and drink, and especially fish. We are told to be grateful for giving control of these to the UK and getting back a per-head share of funding, said Believe in Scotland. Scotland accounts for almost 70% of total UK landings, 63% of the value, and 61% of total catching capacity. In August alone, Scotland's vessels landed £52 million worth of fish, more than triple England's total. Scotland overwhelmingly rejected Brexit, but London has decided to allocate the bulk of its new fund to England. Scotland's Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gurgeon, or anyone else in the Scottish Government or the Scottish fishing industry were not consulted over this decision. It was announced within hours of the Scottish Government being told. Scotland's natural resources fuel the UK, yet our industries are left fighting for scraps from our own wealth. Westminster's actions show control, not cooperation, and devolution has become the art of managing decisions made elsewhere. True fairness and a future where Scotland's resources serve Scotland's people will only come when we take the decisions here, in Scotland, as an independent nation, said Believe in Scotland. A leading polling firm failed to publish data which showed that support for Scottish independence had surged by more than 6%, it's been claimed. YouGov did not draw attention to research it carried out in September, despite finding yes gaining ground on no. The pollster had conducted research on March 21st, which found yes was at 46% to no on 54%. But by September 22, yes had risen to 49%, while no had dropped to 51%. James Kelly, who analyses polls on his blog Scott Goes Pop, first pointed out that the September poll had not been publicised. He said YouGov's actions looked suspiciously like a managing of the narrative. There were two YouGov independence polls in March, which did reach the public domain, and which showed large leads for no, 8-point and 12-point leads respectively. And yet when the next conventional YouGov poll is published in November and shows yes practically level pegging, we're mysteriously told that's a no-change position from the last poll. By that point, most people have forgotten what happened in March and just accept the no-change narrative, and independent supporters lose the benefit of what should have been a dramatic story about a huge swing to yes, in line with the story shown by other polling firms, said Kelly. YouGov said, as with any news site, what we can cover is dependent on the news agenda and team capacity, meaning we can't cover everything. Labour are planning to cut electricity prices for tech companies while energy bills continue to leave Scots families struggling with the highest energy prices in the world. The English UK government has set out plans to slash costs for artificial intelligence data centres, saving companies as much as $80 million a year. Campaigners described the plans as a gut punch to people struggling with the cost of living. In a policy paper called Delivering AI Growth Zones, The English Department for Science, Innovation and Technology said that AI data centre companies should be rewarded if they help to bring down so-called constraint costs. The paper sets out how large energy consumers can offset the costs associated when the level of energy generation in a certain region, for instance Scotland, is greater than the grid is capable of handling. The document said, when data centres locate in Scotland and the north of England, they can harness this generation and reduce the overall cost of our electricity system. Where data centres in AI growth zones facilitate these savings, they will receive a commensurate discount on electricity costs. This would be up to £24 per megawatt hour in Scotland. Kat Jones, the director of the Action to Protect Rural Scotland campaign group, said, "It's shocking that the UK government can reduce energy costs for data centres coming to Scotland, but cannot reduce energy costs for ordinary people who are struggling. We are in a cost of living crisis, and energy costs are especially acute for many people. Hearing that the UK government can lower these bills for data centres is a huge gut punch," she said. Scotland's shipbuilding workforce can compete with the best in the world, but for half a century the industry has been let down by the UK because it doesn't play on a level playing field. A BAE Systems £10 billion deal with Norway to supply 5 Type 26 frigates of a design commissioned by the Royal Navy is a big win for the Clyde. But at the same time, Scotland's shipyards stand to lose out on billions of civil contracts because of a Westminster finance model rigged against them. The poisonous attacks on Ferguson Marine by unionist politicians shows a complete lack of understanding of the wider context, says campaign group Believe in Scotland. For half a century, Scotland's shipyards have not been on a level playing field, and only with independence can Scotland change that. For example, Spain has a tax leasing model. This allows investors to effectively borrow the vessel for 5 to 8 years, and then buy it at the end of the period. It offers Spanish shipyards an effective 20% discount, funded by tax savings. By contrast, Scotland's publicly owned yard Ferguson Marine was trapped in a vicious cycle while building the controversial liquefied natural gas-fueled ferries, Glen Sannox and Glen Rosa, the world's first dual-fuel ferries. Ferguson Marine was too strapped for cash to redesign the vessels, and so were forced to continue building to unlock the next tranche of money, even when flaws were obvious. That trapped the yard in a vicious cycle, desperate to keep the cash flowing and the operation running. Instead of understanding the underlying issues that lay behind this, Scotland's unionist media has mounted continued attack after attack on the yard, most recently by Douglas Alexander at the Labour Party conference, who listed ferries as a Scottish failure. But while other states view shipyards as vital national infrastructure and back them with a range of financial instruments, Westminster insists that commercial banks are the only option, leading to Ferguson being outbid by other countries on ferry contracts. Its bid for 7 electric ferries for Calmac was undercut by a yard in Poland earlier this year. Now Ferguson Marine is staring at an empty order book, without the safety net that state-backed shipyards in independent countries enjoy. Norway, Poland, Turkey, where state investment banks routinely provide long-term loans and refund guarantees as standard. The result is that Scotland's yards excel on defence contracts, but they are starved of vital civil work, ferries, offshore support, research and service vessels, because finance, not steelwork, decides the tender. MSP Paul Sweeney, from a shipbuilding family and a former employee of BAE Systems, raised the issue in Holyrood recently. He wants to see the laws changed at both Holyrood and Westminster on public procurement to allow more state support for Scotland's yards. But Scotland is not an independent country. It doesn't have borrowing powers or the financial levers required to do what other European countries do. For half a century, Westminster has run a finance model that leaves Scotland's shipyards competing with one hand tied behind their backs. We are told to face a free market, while our European rivals arrive with state-backed loans, builders' refund guarantees and tax leasing structures that de-risk complex civil orders. In the early 1970s, Upper Clyde shipbuilders asked for a modest £6 million loan to steady their books. The UK government elected in England but not in Scotland said no, they gave nothing. English Prime Minister Edward Heath ignored the request and went yachting instead. Workers led by Jimmy Reid staged the legendary work-in to prove the point. It wasn't the workers that failed Scotland, it was Westminster. Scotland has the talent. Westminster withholds vital backing. Only independence will give Scotland the tools to back its own shipyards and win civil contracts. Pro-Palestine protesters facing terrorism charges are burning letters from prosecutors offering to let them off with a warning. Among them is award-winning Scottish writer Paul Laverty, who is one of more than 2,000 people across the UK charged with terrorism offences for holding up a placard at protests against Israel's UK-supported genocide of civilians in Gaza. Even though there's meant to be a ceasefire, Israel has continued attacking civilian targets. It has violated the ceasefire at least 497 times since October 10th, killing hundreds of civilians, including women and children. However, under Keir Starmer's crackdown on free speech to save his own blushes about Britain's continued military support of Israel, the protesters were charged with holding up placards or wearing T-shirts supporting the peaceful protest group Palestine Action. Palestine Action was deemed a terror group after spraying red paint on RAF planes to protest about RAF spy flights over Gaza used to identify targets for Israel to bomb. Anyone showing support for the group faces up to 14 years in jail. Laverty was arrested and charged under terror laws on August 25th. However, in September, the Palme d'Or-winning screenwriter had his court case cancelled, as had happened with other Scottish pro-Palestine activists in August. Now, the peaceful protesters have been offered the opportunity to accept a warning and avoid prosecution, even though terrorism is meant to be a very serious charge. In a bid to save face having painted themselves into a corner, the Procurator Fiscal's office has sent letters to protesters which read, "The evidence is sufficient in law to justify my bringing criminal proceedings. I have decided, however, in all the circumstances of the present case, the public interest would be best served by offering a warning. If you accept this warning, or if you are deemed to have accepted it, I shall not prosecute you for the above offence. In those circumstances, that will be the end of active proceedings against you in relation to this matter." It adds that a warning is not a conviction and will not be recorded as one, and that the warning will be considered accepted if it is not refused within 28 days. But instead of accepting the warning, Laverty joined a group of activists at a Gaza Genocide Emergency Committee demonstration in Edinburgh on Saturday, where they burned the letters. It is understood that the activists will be officially writing to reject the offer in the near future, forcing prosecutions the authorities are keen to avoid. That winds up our stories for this week. Join us again at 7 p.m. next Friday, and please like and share this film and tell others about News for Scotland on the Scotland channel. Please also subscribe to the Scotland channel on our YouTube page. Thanks for watching.